the mountain that nobody asked for. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, hello, come in, get comfortable. Grab your blanket, maybe turn the lights down a little, or a lot. We're going full darkness tonight, metaphorically speaking, and also maybe literally, depending on what time you're watching this. Tonight, we're doing something a little different. We're stepping away from the royals and the inbreeding in the Habsburg jaws for just one evening. Don't worry, we'll get back to all of that. And instead, we're going to sit with one of the most quietly devastating survival stories that the 20th century managed to produce. And it did produce quite a few. This is the story of a plane that went into the Andes Mountains in October of 1972 and did not come back out the way anyone expected. This is the story of 45 people, young, hopeful, mostly Uruguayan rugby players and their friends and family who flew into one of the most hostile environments on the planet and then had to figure out what to do next when the plane decided it was done flying. It's a story about cold. It's about hunger. It's about waiting. It's about what happens to a person when the world they knew shrinks down to the size of a broken fuselage half buried in snow. And it's about the choices people make when every single option available to them is, in its own special way, terrible. We're not going to rush. We never rush here. We're going to take our time, float through the details, let the snow settle around us slowly. You don't need to stay awake for this. In fact, it's better if you don't. Just let the story carry you. So, let's begin. The year is 1972. Uruguay is a small country. A lot of people forget it exists, which is a little rude, but geographically speaking, it does get a bit overshadowed by its enormous neighbors Brazil and Argentina on either side. Uruguay is not a large or dramatic place, generally speaking. It's relatively flat, the weather is mild, people live their lives without too much geological interference. The Andes, by contrast, are extremely geological. They are one of the longest and highest mountain ranges on the planet. They run along the western spine of South America for about 7,000 kilometers, which is a number so large becomes kind of meaningless. Just picture a wall of rock and snow that goes on for longer than you can comfortably imagine. Some of the peaks reach over 6,000 meters. The air up there is thin. The temperatures drop to things your body was not designed to handle. The wind comes in sideways and does not apologize for it. The Andes are, in short, not a forgiving place. They were not designed with human comfort in mind. If you were to list the places on Earth where you would most want to be stranded after a plane crash, the high Andes in mid-October would rank somewhere near the very bottom of that list, nestled comfortably between the deep ocean and also the deep ocean, but colder. And yet, here we are. The story begins, as a lot of stories do, with a group of young men who had plans. Specifically, the Old Christians Club rugby team from Montevideo, Uruguay. Now, the name Old Christians sounds like it should belong to a very sedate book club for retired theology professors, but no, this was an active, energetic, reasonably talented amateur rugby team. The players were mostly students or recent graduates of the Stella Maris College in Montevideo, a school run by Irish Christian brothers. The connection to Ireland is relevant only in the sense that it explains the rugby, because Uruguay is not a historically rugby hotbed, but the Irish brought the sport with them and it stuck in certain communities. These were young men in their late teens and early 20s mostly. They were not professional athletes. They were students. They were friends. Many of them had known each other since childhood. They were the kind of people who exist at the center of everyone's social lives. Energetic, well-liked, the sort of group that fills a room when they walk in. You know the type, every school has them. In October of 1972, the team had arranged to fly from Montevideo to Santiago, Chile, for a rugby match. This required crossing the Andes, which is normally done by air without incident. The team had actually chartered a Uruguayan Air Force Fairchild FH-227D, a twin turboprop. It was a military aircraft operated for transport purposes, which sounds perfectly official and official. There were 45 people on board, 40 passengers, and 5 crew members. The passengers included the rugby players themselves, plus a number of friends, family, and supporters who had come along for the trip. Several parents were on board, a few young women. The sort of mixed group that goes on a sports trip. a cheerful, anticipatory crowd who were looking forward to a good match and maybe some nice dinners in Santiago. The flight was not their first attempt, incidentally. They had actually departed from Montevideo on October 12, 1972, and stopped in Mendoza, Argentina, which sits at the foot of the Andes on the Argentine side. The weather over the mountains that day was too bad to cross, so they stopped. They spent the night in Mendoza, probably complained a little about the delay the way one does, probably ate dinner and went to bed and figured they'd be in Santiago the next day and everything would be fine. On October 13th, they departed Mendoza. The weather was still not ideal. There was a cloud layer over the mountains, but the pilots, Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas and Lieutenant Colonel Dante Lagarada, decided to proceed. They chose a southern route through a pass called the Planchon Pass rather than the more direct northern route, which had better navigation aids. This decision has been second-guessed in the years since, as decisions tend to be when they result in a plane going into a mountain. But in the moment, in the cockpit, with the information the pilots had available, it was a judgment call. A reasonable-seeming judgment call, of the kind that gets made constantly in aviation without catastrophic results. This particular one had catastrophic results. The aircraft was flying through cloud cover, which meant the crew was navigating on instruments, specifically on estimated time and dead reckoning, which is a fancy way of saying they were calculating their position based on how fast they were going and how long they'd been going that way, rather than on visual reference or radio navigation. They believed, based on their calculations, that they had already crossed the highest part of the Andes and were descending into Chilean territory. They had not. They were still deep in the mountains. At about 3:30 in the afternoon, the plane broke through the cloud layer, and instead of the relatively flat terrain of the Chilean valley that the crew expected to see below them, they saw mountains. Close mountains. Mountain-shaped mountains going straight up. The pilots immediately attempted to climb. The aircraft began to shudder, and then the right wing clipped a mountain and sheared off, and then the tail section broke away, and then the left wing went. And then what remained of the fuselage, the central body of the plane, essentially a metal tube, skidded down the mountainside at tremendous speed, through the snow, and came to rest in a valley at an altitude of approximately 3,600 meters. All of this happened in seconds. The mountain, it would later be identified, was called Cerro Cellar. The general area was the boundary region between Argentina and Chile, in a remote part of the Andes where there was no infrastructure, no roads, no villages within any reasonable distance. And there sat the fuselage, crumpled, half buried in snow, with the survivors inside figuring out what had just happened to them and what on earth they were supposed to do about it. 12 people died in the crash itself or very shortly after. 33 people survived the initial impact. Several of those 33 were badly injured, broken legs, deep lacerations, internal injuries. The fuselage had buckled and deformed, seats had torn loose, people had been thrown around in ways that human bodies don't particularly enjoy. The pilots were gone. The tail section, which contained the radio equipment and most of the luggage, had separated from the aircraft. What the survivors had was a damaged metal tube, some seats, the clothes they were wearing, a small amount of food that had been on board, some chocolate, some crackers, a few bottles of wine, some jam, and the high Andes mountains spreading out around them in every direction. Let that settle for a moment. 33 people, a broken airplane, a mountain, some chocolate. October in the Andes, at 3,600 meters, means temperatures that can drop to -30 or 40 degrees Celsius at night. It means snow that is often too deep and too soft to walk on. It means an environment specifically and perfectly calibrated to end the existence of warm-blooded creatures who lack proper equipment and shelter. These people had a metal tube and their own body heat. The first thing anyone does in a crisis is try to understand what kind of crisis it is. The survivors, in those first hours, did what survivors do. They tried to help the wounded, they tried to make sense of what had happened, and they tried to figure out who or what might be coming to help them. This is where the first painful irony of the story appears, slow and quiet, the way painful ironies often do. Back in Montevideo and in Mendoza and in Santiago, people knew the plane was missing. The flight had not arrived. Families were being notified. A search and rescue operation was being organized. Help was, in theory, coming. The search operation involved Chilean and Argentine aircraft scouring the Andes for the missing plane. And here is the thing. The fuselage of the aircraft was white. The mountain was white. Snow is famously white. A white object lying on a white surface at high altitude in an area where the searchers weren't necessarily looking in exactly the right place is very difficult to see from the air. The survivors could hear planes overhead on several occasions. They waved frantically. They spelled out SOS in the snow. The planes flew on. The search, ultimately, was called off after 8 days. The Uruguayan and Chilean authorities concluded, not unreasonably given the circumstances, that no one could have survived a crash in that location, in those conditions, for that length of time. The decision was announced. The families were told. The plane was presumed lost. The passengers and crew were presumed dead. And the 33 people still alive on the mountain had no idea. They had managed to get a small transistor radio working, scavenged from the wreckage. One evening, they huddled around it and picked up a Chilean broadcast, and the broadcast said that the search had been called off, that no survivors were expected, that the plane was gone. Imagine hearing that. Imagine being cold and hungry and injured and frightened and turning on a little radio and hearing a voice tell you that you are dead. The impact of that moment on the group has been described by survivors in various ways. Some were devastated in a way that made sense. Some, interestingly, described a kind of clarity settling in, because when the world officially gives you up for dead, the only person left who can decide you're still alive is you. And so they decided. This is where the story stops being about a plane crash and starts being about something else, something slower and quieter, and in some ways more extraordinary. It becomes a story about what people are made of when stripped of every comfort and every assumption they had about how their lives were going to go. Let's settle in further. The worst is not over yet, but neither, it turns out, are the people. The fuselage at the end of the world. The fuselage was not comfortable, in case that needed saying. It was approximately 26 meters long in its original form, but the crash had shortened and deformed it considerably. The usable interior space was cramped. There were broken seats, exposed metal edges, debris. The floor was uneven. The walls, which were aluminum, conducted cold extremely efficiently, meaning that being near them at night was approximately like cuddling up to a very large refrigerator that wanted you to suffer. The survivors quickly established a sleeping arrangement. They slept pressed together, layered, sharing body heat the way animals do when the temperature has opinions about their survival. The seats were piled up to create some kind of barrier. They stuffed the broken windows with luggage and clothing and whatever could be found. They were not warm, but they were less cold than they would have been outside, and in this situation, less cold was everything. The leader who emerged in those early days was a medical student named Roberto Canessa and another named Gustavo Zerbino, both of them young, both in the middle of their medical training, which meant they knew enough anatomy to be useful, but not always enough to fix what they were looking at. They did what they could. They splinted broken legs with pieces of the aircraft. They cleaned wounds as best they could. They were working with almost no proper medical supplies in conditions that would have been challenging for a fully equipped trauma ward, let alone 2 students with improvised tools. Several people who survived the crash died in the following days from injuries. The number of survivors was shrinking. Among the group, leadership organized itself with a quiet kind of urgency. Fernando Parado, who would later become one of the most central figures in the whole story, was not immediately a leader. He had actually been unconscious for 3 days after the crash, having sustained a serious head injury. When he woke up, it took him a moment to understand what he was waking up into. His mother and his sister had both been on the plane. His mother did not survive the crash. His sister Susie was alive, but badly injured. Parado came back to consciousness in a broken airplane on a freezing mountain, learned his mother was dead, watched his sister die 9 days later, and then, apparently, decided, calmly, with remarkable deliberateness, that he was going to survive this thing whatever it took. That's just the kind of person he turned out to be. Some people have a gear that engages in catastrophe. Parado had that gear. The de facto group leader in the formal sense was a young man named Marcelo Perez, who had been the captain of the rugby team. He was organized. He was calm. He tried to maintain order and morale. He was responsible for rationing the food, the small amount of food that existed, with careful fairness. A piece of chocolate here, a cracker there. Whatever the airplane had been carrying in the way of provisions was parceled out with the discipline of someone who understood, intuitively, that what they had was all they were going to have. But food runs out. Even carefully rationed food, shared among 30-plus people, runs out. It runs out faster than anyone wants to think about. Within the first week, the rations were becoming critically small. The survivors began to truly understand the shape of their situation. There was no food source on the mountain. Snow surrounded them. There were no plants, no animals, nothing edible within their reach. The mountain offered them nothing to eat except itself, essentially, which is not a useful thing. Except. This is the part of the story that has followed these survivors their entire lives. The part that made the story famous. The part that when people hear the name of the Andes crash, they think of first. The bodies. The crash had killed a number of passengers. Those bodies were in the snow around the fuselage, preserved by the extreme cold. Perfectly preserved effectively. The mountain, which had given them nothing, had given them this. The decision was not made quickly or easily, or by everyone at once. It was approached slowly, terribly, with enormous internal resistance. Several survivors were unable to bring themselves to participate. The psychological weight of what was being considered was immense and very understandable. But several members of the group, and this included both Roberto Canessa and Fernando Parrado, among others, arrived at an argument that was, in its own cold logic, hard to dispute. The people who had died were gone. What remained was not them, and what remained could sustain the people who were still alive. It was not desecration, it was not dishonor, it was survival. And it was, by any reasonable reading of the situation, the only option that existed. They also framed it, some of them, in religious terms, which matters because these were devout Catholic young men from a conservative Uruguayan social background, and Catholicism was deeply woven into who they were. One of them argued that what they were doing was comparable to the Eucharist, that just as Christ offered his body for the continuation of life, those who had died on the mountain would offer their bodies so that the living might continue. This framing was not cynical, it was deeply felt. It was the way several of them made peace, or tried to, with something that no person should have to make peace with. The decision was made, and they lived because of it. This is not a comfortable thing to sit with. It was not comfortable for them. It would continue to not be comfortable for them for the rest of their lives. They have said so many times in many interviews and books. The act of survival saved them and marked them simultaneously. You don't do something like that and then go on as if nothing happened. You carry it. But they carried it later. In October and November and into December of 1972, what they were focused on was staying alive. And staying alive required food, and this was what they had. Let's float forward just a little. The days in the fuselage had a rhythm. A horrible, grinding rhythm, but a rhythm nonetheless. Wake up cold, try to stay warm, talk, wait. Try not to think too much about home, or about rescue, or about food, or about all the things that were not there. Wait some more. Night came and the temperatures fell further, and everyone pressed together again and waited for morning. They melted snow for water by improvising a contraption, a sheet of aluminum that would absorb the thin sunlight during the day, angled so the meltwater would collect. This was clever. This was the kind of ingenuity that emerges when the alternative to ingenuity is dying of thirst. They made sunglasses out of visors and pieces of the fuselage to protect against snow blindness, which is a very real risk at altitude in a snowfield. The reflected UV radiation from all that white surface is essentially like staring at a very bright lamp with your eyes open for extended periods. Several of them developed significant eye pain before the improvised eyewear was created. They tried to understand where they were. Several of them studied the terrain from the fuselage doorway, looking at the peaks around them, trying to match what they could see to what they could remember of maps. This was difficult for the obvious reason that none of them were experienced mountaineers or navigators, and the Andes all look somewhat similarly massive and indifferent when you're standing at the bottom of one. They had retrieved a small amount of information from the plane's instruments, specifically a rough sense of their altitude and approximate location. They knew they were somewhere in the Andes near the Argentine-Chilean border. They did not know exactly where. They did not have detailed maps. They did not have any of the equipment that would be normal for anyone intentionally planning to be in such a place. Several of them early on attempted small exploratory walks, short excursions to see what lay nearby, to look for anything useful in the wreckage that had scattered across the slope during the crash. These trips were exhausting. At altitude, with inadequate nutrition in deep snow, simply walking any significant distance consumed energy the body didn't have to spare. They moved slowly, they tired quickly. And then, 16 days in, the Andes decided things hadn't been difficult enough. An avalanche. On the night of October 29, 1972, a mass of snow gave way above the fuselage and swept down over it. The survivors were inside the fuselage when it happened. The snow poured through the openings they had not been able to fully seal. Within minutes, the interior was packed with snow. People were buried. Some managed to claw themselves free, others did not. 8 more people died in the avalanche. 8. The group that had already been shrinking from injuries and exhaustion lost 8 more people in a single night. The survivors who remained dug themselves out of the snow with their hands, in the dark, at night, in the cold, understanding that the inside of the fuselage, which had been their shelter, was now also full of snow, and that sleeping there in those conditions could kill those who had survived the avalanche itself. They spent a horrific night inside the snow-packed fuselage, pressed together, waiting for the sun. In the morning, they assessed what had happened and understood the shape of what was left. 27 people were still alive after the avalanche. 27. This is where some people break. This is where the human capacity for endurance runs out for a lot of people. And several of them did break, partially, temporarily. There was despair. There were tears. There was a period where certain individuals stopped eating, stopped trying, started saying that there was no point. Marcelo Perez, who had been leading the group, was one of those who did not survive the avalanche. The informal leadership shifted. New people stepped into the spaces left behind. Parado continued to emerge as a critical figure, calm, purposeful, almost unnervingly steady in a situation that gave him every reason to be anything but. After the avalanche, with the interior of the fuselage cleared of the snow as best they could manage, they began to think more seriously about what they had resisted thinking too concretely about before. They had been waiting for rescue. Rescue was not coming. The search had been called off. No one knew they were alive. If they were going to leave this mountain, they were going to have to leave it themselves. This was the pivot. This was the moment when survival became active rather than passive. Waiting was replaced by planning. Endurance was replaced by intention. And the plan was, straightforwardly and terrifyingly simple. Some of them were going to have to climb out.
The plan that made no sense and was the only plan. Climbing out of the Andes with no equipment is, by any reasonable outdoor recreation standard, not a plan. It is more of a poetic gesture in the direction of a plan. It is a plan in the way that "I'll figure it out" is a plan, which is to say, it is held together entirely by necessity and the refusal of certain individuals to accept the obvious conclusion. The obvious conclusion, in case it needs stating, was that 27 people were sitting at 3,600 meters in one of the most remote and hostile mountain ranges on Earth, in the middle of what was now becoming summer in the southern hemisphere, which meant the weather was technically improving, but the mountains remained the mountains, with no navigation equipment, no climbing gear, no proper cold weather clothing, no food beyond what they were already using to survive each day, and no specific knowledge of which direction would lead them out. The plan was to send some of the stronger members of the group to climb over the mountains, find help, and send rescuers back. Simple. Terrifying. Utterly necessary. Before the main escape attempt, there was some crucial background work that happened in October and November. Specifically, and this took significant effort, a group went back to retrieve the tail section of the aircraft, which had separated during the crash and come to rest some distance away down the slope. The tail section contained the plane's batteries and, critically, the radio equipment. There was a possibility, they thought, of using the batteries to power the radio and contact someone. 3 of the survivors, Parado, Canessa, and Numa Tukati, made the trek down to the tail section. It was a significant journey through difficult terrain, and it required multiple attempts over several days. They did eventually reach the tail section and managed to bring some batteries back to the fuselage. 2 survivors who had some electronics knowledge, Carlitos Paez and Gustavo Nikolich's cousin actually, worked on rigging the batteries to the radio. After considerable effort, and with no small amount of hope, they got the radio connected and transmitted. No one received their transmission. The radio was not working in the way they needed. The battery attempt failed. The connection to the outside world they had hoped for did not materialize. This was another of the quiet, slow devastations of this story, the kind that doesn't arrive with drama. It just settles. They tried. It didn't work. Moving on. Moving on, in this context, meant returning to the central reality. No rescue was coming. Someone had to go. Over the weeks in the fuselage, a natural division had emerged in the group between those who were physically stronger and those who were weaker or injured. Some of the survivors were in no condition to attempt to climb. Others were in reasonable condition, all things considered, which is a phrase that requires some calibration because reasonable condition for this group meant malnourished, cold, psychologically stressed, and living at altitude with inadequate clothing, but at least ambulatory and not suffering from serious injuries. Parado, despite everything, was one of the stronger ones. He was tall, physically capable in the way that rugby players tend to be, and had the kind of stubborn, quiet determination that becomes a survival asset. He was going to be one of the people who went. Roberto Canessa was another. Canessa was more volatile emotionally. He was the kind of person who felt everything and didn't particularly hide it. But he was also fiercely capable and physically strong. He and Parado had a dynamic that worked. They pushed each other. A third man, Antonio Vitintin, would initially join the expedition before being asked to turn back to conserve rations. Before the attempt, the group put themselves through a kind of preparation program. They tried to build up strength by eating a little more. They fashioned equipment as best they could from what the fuselage offered. They made scintillated sleeping bags by sewing together the seat cushions, stuffing them with whatever material they could find that provided insulation. They made crude snowshoes. They fashioned sunglasses. They packed whatever food they could carry. The clothing situation was interesting in the bleak creative way that necessity tends to be. They layered everything they had. They sewed pieces of cloth and material together. Several of them wore women's clothes that had been in passengers' luggage because warmth doesn't have a dress code. They used the airplane's upholstery. They used luggage straps. They rigged themselves as best they could against an environment that was not particularly interested in their efforts. On December 12, 1972, 60 days after the crash, Parado, Canessa, and Vizintin set out. The rest of the group watched them go. Think about that for a moment. Think about being one of the people who stayed behind. You watch 3 people walk away into the snow, up the mountain, away from the fuselage that has been your entire world for 2 months. You do not know if they will make it. You do not know if you will see them again. You do not know if anyone is coming for you, or if these 3 people disappearing into the white are the last real chance you have. And then you go back inside and wait. The climb itself was extraordinary in the most uncomfortable, slow, exhausting way that word can be applied. The Andes are steep. The snow at that altitude is deep and unpredictable. At times, their feet went through the crust. At times, they were climbing near vertical snowfields. They moved slowly. Parado's description of the climb in subsequent accounts is remarkable for its flatness, the grinding, mechanical quality of just continuing to move forward because stopping meant dying. They slept on the mountain in their improvised sleeping bags. The temperature at night at altitude with no proper shelter is not compatible with sleep in any comfortable sense. It is the kind of cold that makes sleep feel like something happening to someone else while you observe from a distance. By the 3rd day, they were nearing the top of the ridge that had been their primary objective, the high point beyond which they hoped the terrain would begin to slope toward lower, warmer, more Chilean-looking country. The climb to the ridge from below is estimated to have involved ascending several hundred meters in altitude. This is not trivial when you are malnourished and the air is thin. At this point, it was decided that Vizintin would turn back. He had been a reliable companion, but the food they had brought, food which I don't need to describe further, was limited, and 2 people could travel further on the same rations than 3. Vizintin constructed a makeshift sled from a plane seat and slid back down the mountain to rejoin the survivors below. Parado and Canessa continued, and then they reached the top of the ridge, and they looked down, and there were more mountains. This is honestly the detail that gets me every time. The completely unreasonable, slightly absurd, entirely human decision to look at more mountains and say, fine, okay, those ones then. They kept going. The descent from the ridge began. The terrain on the western side was different, rockier in places, less snow in the lower elevations. The altitude dropped as they moved. Gradually, incredibly, the white began to give way. Patches of earth appeared, then tufts of vegetation, then more. They were coming down from the snow. They had been walking for approximately 9 days when they first saw the thing that told them it was over, or at least that this particular part of it was over. A river. Water moving. A real river. Water that was not melted snow from a sheet of aluminum, but a genuine flowing river in an actual valley with actual earth on either side. And if you follow a river, it generally leads somewhere. It generally leads down, and eventually out, and toward the places where people are. They followed the river. The man on the horse. On December 21st, 1972, 71 days after the crash of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 572, Fernando Parado and Roberto Canessa reached a valley in Chile where people lived. It was not a dramatic arrival. There was no crowd, no fanfare. Just 2 extremely thin, extremely bearded, extremely weathered young men appearing in a remote Chilean valley where a local herdsman named Sergio Catalan was going about his day. Catalan was on horseback on the other side of the river. The river was too loud for normal conversation across it. Canessa and Parado shouted at him. He could not hear them over the water. He threw them some bread and paper. Parado wrote a note. He explained what had happened. He tied it to a stone and threw it back across the river. Catalan read the note. And then he did something wonderful. He turned his horse around and rode to get help, which is exactly what you would want a person to do in that situation. He rode to the nearest village, Puente Negro, and reported what he had found. The following day, December 22nd, rescuers reached Parado and Canessa by helicopter. Parado immediately, and this is characteristic of him, told the rescue team that there were 14 more survivors on the mountain and that they needed to be reached as soon as possible. 14. Because while Parado and Canessa had been climbing and walking and following a river through the Andes, back in the fuselage, people had continued to die. Of the original 27 who had survived the avalanche in October, only 16 remained alive when the escape attempt began. Parado and Canessa were 2 of those 16, now safe. 14 people were still on the mountain. The rescue operation moved quickly once the location was confirmed. Parado himself got into a helicopter and guided the rescuers back toward the crash site because he was the only person who knew roughly where it was from the ground. On December 22nd and 23rd, all 14 remaining survivors were evacuated from the Andes, 72 days after the plane went down. Let that settle. 72 days in those conditions. 72 days of cold and hunger and loss and waiting and the psychological weight of what survival had required of them. And then helicopters and people and warmth and food and the absolute disorienting, overpowering reality of being brought back into the world. The survivors were taken to hospitals in Chile and then returned to Uruguay. They were thin, seriously malnourished. Some of them had frostbite. They were all deeply, profoundly altered by what they had experienced in ways that would take years to fully understand, and some ways that would probably never be fully understood. The world found out about them very quickly. The story broke in the press and spread with the speed of a story that is genuinely extraordinary, which this one was. The details came out gradually, and yes, the specific detail about how they had survived came out too. It caused exactly the controversy you would expect it to cause. There were people who were disturbed. There were people who were critical. There were people who thought they understood what they were judging and probably didn't. The survivors handled it with more grace than most people would have. They were open about it. They explained it. They offered the religious framing some of them had developed on the mountain. They spoke about it not as something to be ashamed of, but as something that simply was. A terrible decision that was also the only decision, made by people who were not monsters, but who were very, very desperate. The Catholic Church, for what it's worth, was broadly understanding. Several church figures spoke in support of the survivors, noting that moral theology does not require a person to choose death when survival is possible. This was meaningful to many of the survivors, given how central their faith was to their identity. The 16 people who came home from the Andes went on to live lives, actual lives. Roberto Canessa became a doctor, a pediatric cardiologist specifically, which feels right somehow. Fernando Parrado became a successful businessman and motorsports enthusiast and motivational speaker. Others became lawyers, business people, family men. They had children and careers and the ordinary textures of ordinary lives layered on top of the most extraordinary 72 days imaginable. Several of them have spoken and written extensively about the experience. Parrado's book, Miracle in the Andes, published in 2006, is one of the most direct and honest accounts. Canessa co-wrote a book as well. The story has been turned into films, most famously the 1993 movie Alive, based on Piers Paul Reed's book of the same name, which itself was one of the first comprehensive accounts of what happened. The mountain is still there, Cerro Sealer and the surrounding peaks. The crash site is still up there at 3,600 meters, accessible only with serious mountaineering effort. Some wreckage remains. A small memorial has been placed there. Some of the survivors have returned. Some have not been able to or not wanted to. Both are completely understandable. What a mountain does to a person. The story of the Andes survivors is often told as a survival story, which it is. But underneath the survival elements, it's something else. It's a story about what human beings actually are, which is a question that tends to get answered in one of two ways depending on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, and the Andes seems to have done something interesting with that question. Because the human beings on that mountain, by all accounts, were mostly kind to each other. This is the part that doesn't always get emphasized. The violence, the brutality, the social collapse that you might expect, the thing that movies often reach for when depicting people in extremis, largely didn't happen. There were tensions, there were disagreements, there were people who were more capable and people who were less so. There were moments of despair and selfishness. These were people, not saints. But they also shared. They organized. They took care of their wounded. They had debates about ethics and theology and what was right. They formed a community inside a broken airplane, and that community, however fragile and however painful its internal workings, held together for 72 days until it could be rescued. Roberto Canessa has talked about the moral weight of the decisions made on the mountain, not just the one decision that gets all the attention, but all of them. Every day contained decisions. Who got how much food? Who would go on the expedition? How to care for someone who was giving up? How to talk to each other about the things that were happening? Fernando Parrado has spoken about something that the mountain took from him and also gave him, a certain clarity about what actually matters. He has said in various interviews that after you have been through that, the small anxieties of normal life have a hard time landing with the same weight. The things people worry about, reputation, status, minor setbacks, become difficult to take seriously when you have a point of comparison that looks like a frozen valley in the Andes. This is not a comfortable kind of wisdom. It's the kind that costs something to acquire. Several of the survivors returned to their rugby team and the social world they had come from. Several became very close, bonded by something that cannot really be explained to anyone who wasn't there. The shared experience of the mountain created a connection between the survivors that existed on a different plane from ordinary friendship. Not always easy, not always comfortable, but real, permanent. Some of the survivors have struggled with the aftermath in ways that don't always make it into the public accounts. Post-traumatic stress in its various forms, the difficulty of returning to a normal life when what you have experienced has fundamentally altered your sense of what normal means. The particular challenge of being a public figure, known always for the most extreme experience of your life, while also just being a person who needs to go to the grocery store and have bad days and get through Tuesday. They have managed, mostly. The 16 who came back are, many of them, now in their 70s. They have had long lives. They have families, grandchildren, some of them. The young men on that plane in 1972 are old now. The 32 who did not survive are still there in some sense, in the accounts of the survivors, in the memorial on the mountain, in the families who lost them 50-plus years ago and carry that loss quietly into their own old age. The machinery of survival and other slow thoughts. Let's drift back for a moment to the fuselage, because we haven't quite done justice to the daily texture of what it was like inside that space for the people who waited. The people who made the final climb, Parado, Canessa, Vizintin, were 3 out of 27. The other 24 who were alive at that point remained at the crash site. And while the escape was being attempted, those 24 people were doing the extraordinarily difficult work of simply continuing to exist. The weather in December in the Andes at that altitude was what it was, which is to say, it was cold at night and marginally less cold during the day. The snow had settled somewhat after the spring thaw that comes to the Andes in November and December. The temperatures were no longer the extreme negative figures of the early weeks. They were still well below freezing at night, but the sun during the day was strong at altitude. The survivors had developed small routines, small meaningless-seeming routines that were in fact crucial, because routine is what keeps a person from spending all their time inside the space where despair lives. They melted snow for water. They talked. They told stories. They played word games. They held religious observances. Prayer was consistent throughout the time on the mountain, a form of structure and meaning and connection to something beyond the immediate situation. Carlos Paez Rodriguez, known as Carlitos, was one of the survivors, and his accounts of the waiting time emphasized the way the group tried to create some kind of interior life inside the exterior disaster. People told jokes. People talked about their families, their girlfriends, their plans for after. The plans for after were perhaps the most important thing, the mental act of projecting yourself into a future that continued, that included you, that had a next chapter. Some of the survivors have said that faith was the difference. Faith in a religious sense, that God had put them there for a reason, that they were meant to survive, that what they were enduring had meaning in a framework that extended beyond the immediate suffering. Others have been more secular about it, but most describe some form of belief in rescue, in themselves, in each other, in the eventual existence of a world outside the mountain as essential. The alternative to belief in that situation was a particular kind of calculation. The calculation that said, count the odds, look at the resources, assess the situation, conclude that the outcome is unlikely to be good. Several survivors have described fighting this calculation actively, refusing to let it settle, because once you accept the logical conclusion becomes the only thing you're working toward. Numa Turkati was one of those who struggled most deeply. He had been on the expedition to recover the tail section batteries, and the experience had taken something from him. He became quieter. He ate less. He began to weaken in a way that was not purely physical. He died on December 11th, the day before Parado and Canessa set out for the rescue clan. He was 25 years old. His death hit the group hard, and in particular Parado, who had known him well. In his book, Parado describes Turcote's decline with grief and honesty. He could not fix it. No one could fix it. Sometimes the mountain won. But Turcote's death the day before the departure gave the departure an added urgency. It made real, again, the stakes of waiting. Waiting was not neutral. Waiting had a cost. Every day on the mountain was a day that cost something from the finite reserves of each person there. The departure of Parado, Canessa, and Vizintin on December 12th was accompanied by a kind of formal, almost ceremonial send-off from the remaining group. Those who were staying watched those who were going. There were embraces, there were prayers, there were things said that were essentially goodbyes, because nobody knew if they were goodbyes or not, and in that uncertainty, you might as well say what you mean. And then the three figures moved off up the slope, and got smaller, and disappeared into the white. And the 14 remaining survivors went back inside and waited. 8 days. That's how long they waited between the departure and the rescue. 8 more days of the same routine: water, food, prayer, talk, word games, the mental exercise of projecting into a future that still had not confirmed it would include them. 8 days. On December 22nd, a helicopter appeared. The accounts of that moment, the first sound of the helicopter, the visual of it approaching, the reality of it landing, of actual people from the outside world stepping out of it, these accounts are different in detail, but the same in emotional tenor. It was not entirely real at first. It took a moment for the brain to accept that what was happening, and then it was real, and then it was over. Or rather, the being stranded part was over. The rest of it, what it meant, what it cost, what it gave them, how they were going to live with it, that part was just beginning. The long walk back to everything. Coming home is its own kind of difficulty. The survivors arrived in Chile, thin, bewildered, technically alive, and entered a world that had moved on while they were on the mountain. 60 days had passed. Christmas was 3 days away. Their families had grieved and were in the process of ungriefing. The press was camped outside the hospitals. Everyone wanted to know everything immediately. The return to Uruguay was emotional in the way that defies adequate description. The families who had lost people were still lost. The families of the survivors got them back. These events happened at the same time, in the same small country, in the same social circles, and the complexity of that, the grief alongside the joy, the mourning alongside the relief, was something the survivors stepped back into the middle of. Several of the survivors have talked about the particular challenge of being perceived a certain way after the story became public. They were, for many people, heroes, miraculous survivors, living proof of extraordinary human endurance. And that perception, however understandable, had a way of flattening them into something less than fully human, because heroes in the public imagination don't usually have ordinary days, don't struggle with grocery shopping and bad moods, don't experience the completely mundane difficulties of regular life. But they did. Of course they did. They were people. Roberto Canessa returned to his medical studies and completed his degree and became the cardiologist he had been on his way to becoming when the plane went down. There's a particular resonance to that, to completing the thing you were interrupted in the middle of, to returning to the trajectory your life had been on and picking it up again. He has said in interviews that he wanted to spend his life saving lives, in part as a way of making something meaningful from what happened. Parado went in a different direction, building a business career and becoming involved in motorsports. He has spoken widely about the experience over the years, given talks, written, appeared in documentaries. He seems to have developed a relationship with the story that is both open and controlled. He tells it. He chooses how he tells it. He uses it. Several of the others went on in quieter ways. into lives that were not defined publicly by what had happened, even if privately the mountain was never far from the surface. The friendship between the survivors has lasted. There are gatherings, there are commemorations. On significant anniversaries, they have returned to public view together. In 2022, on the 50th anniversary of the crash, there was significant media attention. The survivors who were still alive, most of them, remarkably, gave interviews. They were old men by then, old men who had once been young men on a cold mountain. The crash is part of Uruguayan national memory in a way that is somewhat unusual. It is not a straightforward heroic narrative. The circumstances are too complicated for that. But it is a story about Uruguayans who endured something extraordinary and came home, and that has a kind of gravity to it. Piers Paul Reed's book, Alive, published in 1974, is still the most comprehensive account and is widely considered excellent reporting. Reed was given access to the survivors, and they spoke to him at length. The book is calm and detailed and does not sensationalize, which is both unusual for the subject matter and entirely appropriate. The 1993 film with Ethan Hawke is fine. Films always compress and rearrange. If you've seen it, you have a rough impression, but the book will give you something the film can't: the slow accumulation of detail, the texture of what each day was actually like, the interior lives of people that a 2-hour film can only sketch at. There's also a 2023 Netflix film, Society of the Snow, a Spanish-language production directed by J.A. Bayona, which received significant praise for its handling of the material. It is more visually immersive than the 1993 version and arguably more faithful to the full scope of the story, including the people who died and the way death moved through the group. For a sleep video, I don't especially recommend watching any of these right before bed, but during daylight hours, with a blanket, at a reasonable volume, fine.
Snow, time, and the particular piece of no good options. Let's go back to the mountain one more time, not to revisit the darkest details, but to sit with the landscape itself for a moment. The Andes, from photographs and from the accounts of those who have been there, are undeniably beautiful. This seems almost beside the point in the context of what happened there in 1972, but it's true. At 3,600 meters, on a clear day, the view in every direction is massive and white and silent in a way that very few places on Earth are. The sky at altitude is a particular shade of blue that you don't get at sea level. The light on snow has a quality that photographers specifically go into mountains to find. The survivors were aware of this. Several of them have mentioned it, the terrible beauty of the place where they were stranded, the way the mountain looked in the morning, the sunrises over the peaks, the absolute stillness of a cold night with stars overhead that are brighter at altitude than they are anywhere else. Beauty and suffering sharing the same space is not unusual. They do this more often than we tend to acknowledge. But in the Andes in 1972, the contrast was so sharp and so sustained that the survivors couldn't avoid it. They lived inside one of the most spectacular natural landscapes on Earth, and it was trying to kill them the whole time. The area where they crashed is sometimes visited now by mountaineers. It requires serious equipment and experience to reach. There is a metal cross at the site, placed there in subsequent years by some of the survivors and their families. A small memorial in a place that very few people will ever see in person. The rest of the plane is still there. Most of it, the fuselage, or what remains of it after decades of weather. The Andes don't give things back, particularly. What goes in tends to stay in, which is its own kind of testament to why surviving the Andes is as remarkable as it is. The survivors have returned. Several of them have gone back, Parado among them and others, to see the place, to stand where they stood, to bring it into dialogue with who they are now, 50+ years later. What that experience is like for them, I cannot say, because it is not something that translates. But they went. Several of them felt they needed to. What the mountain means to them now is probably different for each of them.
For some, it might be primarily something survived, a phase that ended, that they got through, that is finished even if it's also never quite finished. For others, it may still be the central fact of their identity, the thing around which everything else organizes. For others still, perhaps something in between, acknowledged, present, carried, but not overwhelming. Trauma is not uniform. It does not produce the same results in different people. Two people can go through the same experience and come out with very different inner landscapes. This is not a failure of either person. It's just how it works. What seems consistent across most of the survivors' accounts is a kind of gratitude, sometimes uncomplicated, sometimes complicated, but present. Gratitude for being alive, gratitude for the people who kept them alive, gratitude for the ordinary, unremarkable fact of being in the world. Roberto Canessa has spoken about watching his patients' hearts on monitors in his work as a cardiologist, the small peaks and valleys of a beating heart, and what that means to him given what he has lived. He knows what it costs to keep a person alive. He knows it in a very specific, embodied way that most cardiologists, fortunately, do not have to learn in the way he did. Parado has talked about the way the mountain changed his understanding of love. His mother died. His sister died. In those deaths, in that place, something was clarified about what the people in your life actually mean and what loss actually is. He came home and held his family differently. These are small things to say about a large experience, but large experiences are ultimately made of small things. The climb out of the Andes is made of one step, and then another step, and then another step after that, in the cold, when you're tired, when you can't quite see the end yet. The survival inside the fuselage is made of one day and then another day, one conversation, one prayer, one cup of melted snow. This is what the story is actually about, at its deepest level. Not the extraordinary event, but the ordinary courage of just continuing, of getting up again, of trying the next thing, of refusing, in some quiet, stubborn, very human way, to give in.
And now, friends, we float down toward the end of this. It's late, or early, or whatever hour it is when you find yourself still listening to someone talk quietly about something that happened a long time ago in a mountain range that most people will never visit. The 16 survivors of Flight 571 went home on December 22nd and 23rd of 1972 and continued to be alive, which is the important part. They continued to be alive. 29 of the 45 people who boarded that plane in Montevideo did not come home. They are there on the mountain, or they are carried in the hearts of the families they left. They were young. They were going to a rugby match. It is one of those griefs that sits in a particular category, the arbitrary, unwarned, impossible to prepare for kind, the kind that lands on ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. The world remembers the story now largely because of the survival, because 16 people came back when no one expected anyone to, because 2 men walked out of the Andes on their own feet and brought rescuers to the rest, because the human capacity for endurance turned out to be somewhat larger than the Andes had anticipated. But I think it's also worth remembering the 29, quietly, without drama. They were real. They had names. They had families and plans and things they were looking forward to. They flew into a mountain in October of 1972, and they did not come out. That is a simple fact that sits alongside the remarkable story of the survivors and deserves its own space. History is usually written about the people who survived things. The dead become context. They become background. They become the reason the story has weight. But they were also the story. Okay. We've been here for a while now. The fire is low. The lights are dim. The Andes are very far away. And the night is very quiet wherever you are.
Sometimes the most important stories are the ones about ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and just kept going. Not because they were heroes in any cinematic sense, not because they had special training or divine intervention or any particular advantage, but because they decided to keep going. Because one more day was possible, so they did one more day, and then another. There's a version of this story where it ends on the mountain, where everyone who went in doesn't come out. That version exists. It's the version that was reported in October of 1972 when the search was called off. The world had already written that version and moved on. The version we have is the other one, the improbable one. The one where Parado and Canessa follow a river and find a herdsman on a horse and write a note on a piece of paper and tie it to a stone and throw it across a river. That version is better. Sleep well, everyone. If you're still awake, maybe close your eyes now. Let the mountains be far away. Let the cold be someone else's story. You're warm. You're comfortable. You made it through the day. That's enough. Good night.